Welcome to the Health Systems CIO Show. I'm your host, founder, and editor, Anthony Guerra. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Shauna Overgaard, Assistant Professor for Clinical Translational Science, Senior Director for AI Strategy and Frameworks, and Co-Director of the AI Validation and Stewardship Research Program with the Mayo Clinic. Dr. Overgaard, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, Anthony. It's an honor to have the opportunity. Yes.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Looking forward to this chat. You want to start off by telling me a little bit about your organization and your many roles?
Yes. I think to set the stage, my work really sits at the intersection of Mayo's enterprise AI strategy, the translational science, as you mentioned, clinical translational science research, and clinical implementation. And so I focus on helping our health systems, as well as those nationally and globally, and working on strategies to translate this promising AI into accountable clinical capabilities. And this is done through clear evidence, our shared ownership, and then life cycle stewardship as well. Mayo is a nonprofit. We're also an integrated academic health system. And so this is one that's organized around, we have three shields: clinical practice, research, and education. And I would say that this is quite fortuitous in that the integrated model itself is an ideal setting for our development, our rigorous scientific testing, and then the translation of our solutions into clinical practice. And the observation that is, I think, allowed by having each of those functions available. The models that we create might originate in research, but they need to be essentially integrated through our digital and technology teams. They'll require governance, our regulatory review, but they ultimately only succeed at the point of care. And so because of this, we have a direct line of sight for the entire AI life cycle, and then how each of these pieces connects across each of the boundaries. And so as Senior Director of AI Strategy and Frameworks, Mayo Clinic Center for Digital Health, I review kind of the opportunities available to us in forming the strategy to surface opportunities to create either additional functions or services for translation, co-directing the AI validation and stewardship program, and then with the purview of assistant professor in clinical translational science, I also have the opportunity to do research in each of those areas. But across these roles, I lead the development of our standardized, more risk-tiered approaches to define things like documentation, testing, implementation, monitoring, and then adapting, and when necessary, retiring some of our AI solutions as well. My leading up to this, I guess, my training in biomedical informatics and biostatistics, I was brought into my role as a translational informatician. And my first mission was to help understand and determine why our AI models were reaching PubMed through research and publication, but not necessarily making it into clinical practice. And so was asked to perform a landscape analysis at our institution and then nationally, which led to identifying barriers to translation. And you'll probably not be surprised that much of this mapped consistently to what's known in the field of translational science as our bench to bedside chasm. And from my perspective, the maybe greatest catalyst that my work and our team's work produced was identifying and aligning our subject matter experts across the life cycle, and then developing a comprehensive evaluation framework to surface much of these opportunities and then mitigate the risks to streamline the AI translation. This was done through opportunities through the American Medical Informatics Association. And with this, I think we were able to determine that the surfacing the model itself, and the model itself isn't just the intervention, but rather it's the entire interaction between the clinician, the AI model, and the patients. And so thinking about this in terms of testing and determining whether or not an AI solution is safe, useful, and sustainable required a comprehensive framework where our subject matter experts would perform kind of at the top of their license, each of them coming with a predefined, I think, mental model or purview for what would be required for safe and effective AI.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when approaching this type of work, the thing that stood out to me and was, I think, primarily generated by discussion from one of my mentors at the time, through AMIA, Gretchen Purcell Jackson. She said that scientific evidence is the language of trust in healthcare, which really stood out as we were thinking about trying to identify some of the barriers to implementation. She recommended that I bring all of the stakeholders into the same room, which she acknowledged would be incredibly difficult to do, first of all, but to hear everyone out in terms of what they thought would be of greatest value, or what would be most imperative to capture and to assess. And I kind of say all of this because at the time, and this was almost exactly 5 years ago when I began as a translational informatician at Mayo, we really didn't understand everything that might be required or all of the potential risks involved in AI. And this, I think, was in part because, as I mentioned, many of the opportunities for AI were kind of stuck in this research cycle, kind of ending in PubMed or ending in manuscript, but we weren't seeing it surfaced or implemented into clinical practice. And so now I think the defining factor has become how to go about the streamlined evaluation when we are looking to constantly innovate, rectifying or being able to smooth this tension between innovation and rigorous science. So I think a lot of my work has been at that intersection. A lot of the learnings have been there, but I think the programs that we've developed and the approach, and I think the impetus for this engagement with you, thinking about the human factors components and adoption and implementation have been central, I think, just to the learnings that have taken place over the last several years.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Do you consider the pace at which people can absorb change in some of this work? Is that a human factor? The fact that my workflow was adjusted or a new tool rolled out, and that people need a certain amount of time to absorb before we can. There's so much coming out. There's so many new tools. Is that part of it? Saying, oh, and you could take it unit by unit, person by however granular you want to get. You could say this unit, they're good. Let's leave them alone for a couple of months, right? They just had a tough implementation or whatever. But this one, they can, they're pretty steady state, so we can introduce something over here. How does that factor into any of your work?
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. The I think so. The way that we often, I think, approach innovation or determining which group to introduce an AI solution into, it's become more and more led by our clinicians themselves. And so the model, I think, when I first started, was we had kind of a group of engineers, the Center for Digital Health, that was building out AI products, AI solutions. And part of that tension was we have all of this potential value, all these resources invested, we need to implement. But what was found was that when we went and tried to approach clinical teams, there was a quite a bit of resistance. I think not only clinicians at Mayo Clinic, but other clinicians who are very well, all clinicians being very well trained and scientifically minded. One, I think, wanted input. It's their practice.
Hmm.
They are used to doing things as evidence-based. Without that type of evidence, and this is, I think, where Dr. Purcell Jackson had emphasized this scientific evidence is the language of trust in healthcare. For me, that I think brought out the opportunity to connect how we approach research in general, and the evidence-based mentality. And so the I think in terms of identifying who and where and when to implement an AI solution, if we found that prioritizing identification of a clinician champion, and this is actually now even built into our policies, the need to have a clinician champion, the need to have someone who's going to own the outcome and be accountable for it, involved in the co-development, that really becomes the driver of how the tool not only is developed, tested and validated, but also introduced into a clinical environment, a clinical team. And because that model has changed so much over the last several years, it's it would be unusual for a product team to say approach a clinical practice and say, we have this available, can we include it? It's more clinicians now are often those that are funded within Mayo Clinic to innovate. And then I think, most often identify a product team to work with them in developing their AI tools.
Hmm.
I think the evidence of that kind of generation is also apparent in that I think majority, or I know the majority of our AI tools are built in-house rather than being adopted from external vendors even. Um,
Yeah.
but
So that's interesting. So,
uh,
um, your simulate AI validation and stewardship programs. Um, it's interesting. You have a lot of organizations get most of their tools from vendors. Um, Organizations like yours can do a lot of building, and now with things like Epic Agent Factory, more and more people can do building, if we're calling that building, which we can. Um, so you would want your simulation testing to help inform the building going on in your organization, that they would see you as a resource to workshop some of their build as it's being put into place, and then slowly dip its toe into workflow more and more, but start with the validation with the simulation because it's sort of the lowest hurdle. We're not impacting workflow, and we can get a sense of if we're on the right track. So you have are trying to do that, incorporate it into their work?
yeah, and thanks for pointing that out too. Um, I think like the direct tie is the way that we approach our understanding of how the workflow baseline functions. And I think that so some of the learnings from kind of the development of the AI evaluation frameworks, and we established this Enterprise AI Translation Advisory Board initially. So it brought in subject matter experts from across the AI life cycle to kind of weigh in on what we need to be surfacing in terms of risk and
Uh-huh.
opportunity value. When we would have our researchers presenting cases for input from the board, the I think bottleneck or barrier was this shared understanding of the workflow itself. And it sounds so obvious now that after having experienced this and I say it out loud, But having an implementation scientist do a shadowing of
Yeah.
the workflow itself, and being able to bring that back to the board, to share kind of as foundationally, here's the problem that these researchers or innovators are trying to solve. Here's how things are currently going, baseline metrics, etc. And here is exactly the recommended insertion point for the AI solution. That learning, that model, kind of that approach is also what we use in the simulation development. So in order to create a realistic setting or environment, we observe the actual realistic environment. And then we partner with our simulation colleagues, who have, been doing this for a very long time. In fact, I think since the 60s at Mayo, this kind of program has been around, but it's been used and refined specifically for clinician education.
Hmm.
Um, and so they're already very used to creating these realistic environments. And so by using that model to begin testing our AI solutions, we have these natural partners, in addition to leveraging their program, which has over 100 standardized patients available as well.
Yeah, I mean, you make an excellent point about knowledge of the workflow, and the people I speak to traditionally would be, most of the CIOs and the CMIOs and the CISOs, on the IT side supporting the enterprise, and it comes up again and again, the importance of deeply, deeply understanding the workflows, being close to the work. Obviously, your clinical types, your CMIOs and CNIOs came from the work, but a lot of your IT executives might have come up through infrastructure and networking and things like that. They work intentionally to get on the floor, to round, to understand. You can't support what you don't understand. Um, and if you're a researcher or an innovator and you're trying to develop things for the bedside, you need to understand the bedside and the workflow, or you're not going to get it right. And that, you mentioned that bench to bedside gulf. That's certainly one area you want to look at if there's a gulf, right? Because it comes up all the time. Those workflows are so different from one ward to the next, from one unit to the next. There is no one size fits all. You don't know all the workflows, you know one workflow. And that same workflow in that particular clinical area, if you went to different health systems, you'd probably see three different workflows, right?
Yes.
So just talk a little bit more about that aspect of getting close to the workflow that you're trying to assist, whatever way you're trying to assist it.
Yeah. Um, I think again, an exact example of, I think, to emphasize your point. So we're looking at, we're testing an external partner's solution,
Hmm.
getting some of this work. And so it's in neuro-oncology. And as you probably know, Mayo has a Rochester, Florida, Arizona campus, but we also have the Mayo Clinic Health System, which is kind of a conglomerate of community-based hospitals. And so even in our initial observations, we've we've noted, like, the clinician leads, and the clinical teams themselves perform differently within the Rochester campus and the community-based hospital campuses. And so I think, to your point, like getting to understand the nuances. One big factor, just with this example, is the amount of time that our clinicians can spend with patients. Um, and I think also just the mindset of either patient preparation, patient engagement, the expectation of patient input into how clinical teams perform. And then also the exposure to AI in general is something that, even within our own health system, differs sometimes quite substantially. Um, and so the um, the way that we approach it is always we want to be supportive of the clinical team primarily. We want them to be able to accomplish their goal, which is to prioritize patient needs. And we have done this poorly in the past, where we've kind of walked in and made recommendations for a simulation study, kind of based off of what we think, is the obvious scenario. And I think that's, becomes not only offensive, but it doesn't allow to create that kind of partnership mentality that inevitably will be required when we go to implement a solution into clinical practice. Just even the engagement of a clinician champion at the outset to say, in this instance, I can give this partner. So Mayo and other institutions, I'm sure, function under different types of agreements. We have found that partnership is, I think, foundationally one of the most important ways to approach this type of work, especially as we're developing, say, our protocols and risk mitigation strategies. So, for instance, a partner might want to implement into Mayo Clinic. We just taking that on and saying, we think your solution is valuable, is far less likely to make traction than if they were to ask for our scientific input into co-developing in a sense, or having this kind of know-how agreement in place to improve their product. I think similarly, when we're looking to test and evaluate a solution, bringing the clinician and clinical teams in at the outset to even see, like, what are your problems? How do you approach this? How would you develop a type of test? What's most important to you? And letting them lead the relationship is probably one of the greatest investments that our teams can make in doing any of this type of work.
Um, you mentioned the idea of partnership with the clinicians, with the users.
Mhm.
Um, that's not always easy, right? I mean, they're super busy, Maybe this probably certainly is the best way to help them, is to get them to engage with you and be partners. But they're very busy people, and you have to be very careful with asking for their time. You have to make sure that when they do give you their time, you do good things with it, and they see value out of the time they've spent with you, or you might not get a second chance. Um, you know, we
So,
work, they serve at the pleasure of the president. We've seen these things in movies, right? You work for the support of these people. That's probably the most important thing in your work, are those relationships.
I agree.
And so, how do you go about making sure you're sensitive to their busy schedule? You only ask them for things you absolutely need them for, and you make the best use of their time when you get it.
Yes, exactly. The way that I've found to be most effective is bringing them in as thought leaders. And so I think immediately recognizing their expertise and the inevitable failure if they're not engaged entirely in quickly. The um, when we have in the past, and I'm thinking like even early on, a couple of years ago, and this remains to be an issue, and so I just want to be transparent that we're still working on solving this. But intellectual contributions, so thinking about what what is of value, and at Mayo, I mentioned kind of this academic health center model. Um, Advancement of academic promotion is incredibly valuable. And so, because we're approaching this from an evidence-based mentality, evidence-based standards, I approach each of these problems also as a research opportunity, even a publication opportunity, knowledge dissemination. So, in engaging through these new or innovative kind of testing approaches, they are inherently contributing to that thought leadership. What ends up the potential breakdown, of course, is having participants contribute to the research itself. So normally you want to keep that separate. And so we've looked at models for engaging clinical teams and clinician leaders as scientific partners in terms of investment or gaining potential downstream revenue in that partnership model, in addition to manuscript publication. The testing piece, and actually just before this call, I was working with our teams to we're developing our scenarios and practicing with our standardized patients for a study that will run on Monday and Tuesday. Within those settings, we need to be able to recruit our clinicians kind of almost like a back-to-back scenario so we can just run it in the simulation center with the time allotted. We have really struggled, despite the energy and excitement about this specific case, to get clinicians to be able to essentially donate their time to this work. And this, I think, will continue to happen, of course, because in the type of, I think, reciprocity model or remuneration model that's often available in research, it's that we will give them back time. So we have kind of at Mayo and other centers, I suspect, like there's protected time to do research.
Hmm.
But what often happens is that's just absorbed, and the clinicians don't ever see the benefit. It's just less time that they have available. So that's where the intellectual contribution comes in, and then the potential, I think, payment or revenue opportunity by partnering, especially with an external company, might
Hmm.
exist. So I've looked at developing, and we're piloting this now, clinician AI testing core. So like identifying clinicians that are very interested in AI so that they get kind of this exposure to these new technologies, capabilities, but also the methods, ability to contribute to the methods that we're developing. That's that thought leadership opportunity as well as exposure. And then formalizing their engagement through the creation of a testing core. Um, we're looking at also having like funds to support them. So they might contribute. What is it? What might they be paid outside of their, and again, Mayo's like a salary-based function. And so
Hmm.
is there anything that can be paid above and beyond that salary in order to bring them in? This is again still something we're working through. The call I had kind of resolved with the fact that we might need to consider an ad hoc model, and that much of this also has the potential to be kind of a telehealth based scenario where we can do um, Teams or Zoom calls with our AI solutions, which are often kind of web-based applications, and scheduling with our standardized patients these virtual calls where we can observe our clinicians in interacting with the AI solution, and then bringing our methods and models into more of a remote type of testing setting as well. But yeah, it's brought out quite a bit of creative thinking.
I'm laughing because it's very, it sounds very complicated, but it's really just make it worth my while.
Exactly.
I mean, this is very simple stuff here on a certain level. It's like, you want my time, right? You
Yes.
want my time, make it worth my while, whether it's credit for publishing, paying me some sort of time allotment, and as you said, now maybe we can hit it at a number of ways. We can pay you, you can get credit for publishing, and you don't have to come in because we could do it remotely. Okay,
Exactly.
I'm in. Let's do it. Now you got
Yeah.
me, right?
Yes, exactly, Anthony. And my husband's a clinician, and I'll run physician in internal medicine, and of course, like I run all of these, ideas past him,
Sure.
and he's like, no, he's like, Sean, no one would ever go for that. What? Like we don't like literally like we don't have time for that. You've got to sweeten the deal, and of course, and he's like incredibly supportive, as are his friends. But another solution that we've been thinking about is um, not only this web-based thing, but what about after hours? So do we really need a standardized patient to be on the call in some of these instances? So
Uh-huh.
like can I narrow the scope of like some of the initial work to the real interaction? And so I'm also thinking about like a web-based capability where clinicians can engage with the tool on their own time, but have some of these observation capabilities built in. And I'm hoping we'll see where that goes, but that's kind of another way that we're thinking about approaching some of the testing with it for the initial stages where we need like an increased N, and we want to do some of these randomized designs along with it.
Yeah, and it could be where you offer a variety of options. So some
Right.
clinicians may say, I don't want to do this at night. Some of them may say, I want to do it during my workday. You say, okay, here's how we can do that. Some of them say, I don't want to do it during the workday. I can do it at night or on the weekend. Okay, here's how we, right? Options.
Yes, exactly. And along with that too, like bringing the metrics, the team, et cetera, directly to them. So like going to their floor, and being flexible, and instead of
Hmm.
having them come all the way to the simulation center is
Yeah.
also another way that we've been thinking through it. Let me get you.
Yeah, and I've heard this come up on the pure IT side when I'm speaking to CIOs and they're developing councils and groups of their clinicians that they want to give feedback, and they've had to formalize it and create, pay them,
Yes,
so it's got to be done on the pure IT side to get engagement. Now you can imagine you've got the CIO group speaking to the same possible group of people as you're speaking to, right? There's a lot of people that want their time. So they're getting hit from multiple angles. Hey, I need you for this. Hey, I need you for that. And we're all trying to help you, right? We're all saying we want to help you, but they're saying,
yes,
I don't have enough hours in the day as it is. And
yes,
I've got all these people that want to help me.
right.
So it's, listen, it just boils down to, as you said, making it the best deal you can with as much flexibility as possible. And I'd like your reaction to this. Of course, it's this idea of you cannot waste a minute of their time, right? You can't have you set it up and they're engaged and it doesn't work, or the patient doesn't show up, or the tool doesn't work, or they throw their hands up and say, okay, that's it. I'm not coming back.
Yeah.
So it's just that heightened level of pressure to get it right when you do get buy-in.
Yes, yes. We have simulations and dry runs for our simulation.
Right. Right.
Not even
Of
kidding.
course.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, like people always joke, you have the meeting before the meeting, right? When there's a big
Yeah.
meeting, people have the meeting before the meeting, so they go into the meeting ready for the meeting.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And
Oh, it's good stuff. Go ahead, please.
and that's I think too where a lot of these frameworks, protocols, templates, database systems are things that I'm trying to I guess create in terms of artifacts for scalability and repetition. So the way that I will often approach like, the AI translation, evaluation strategy, et cetera, is like I'll find this gap or opportunity to do this intervention or thing that would inherently support the enterprise in
Hmm.
achieving our goal. But then it is always we need to create this repeatable process. We need to
Yes.
automate. We need to capture the appropriate data. And so our teams have also been building essentially a database to think about what would be the most valuable aspects, both to observe and record And then linking that type of thing to mitigation strategy. Um, we're also looking at, so the simulation center has hours and hours of recordings, knowledge, all of this kind of intellectual know-how built in to the way that they've created these educational scenes and modules. And so I'm working on like developing this program to more quickly generate simulation testing protocols based off of the questions that we have in mind, and then to be able to share that and replicate it. And I'm hoping that goes somewhere. I'll be presenting on that in November at AMIA. So some of the work, and hopefully we'll publish on it. I'll let you know.
You should. You
Yeah.
should. Yes, you said repeatable process, which is sort of a mantra of my life. Like I just
Yeah.
so I read a book 20 years ago. I think it was called The E-Myth Revisited. It's one of these famous books on business or what, a guy, Michael Gerber. And it just bored into my brain about repeatable processes. If you're going to be successful at anything, you have to have it's sort of the franchisement. Why do franchises work? Why are they all successful? Because they figure something out and then they standardize it over, a million times, a billion times, small little refinements until you can make the perfect French fry. And
Yeah.
then every single one of them has to do it the same way. So that you go to a McDonald's in California or New York, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So you do things, we all do things, a number of things that we do over and over again, right?
Mhm.
We all do certain things. So I think you mentioned the idea of speed here, which has come up in different discussions about the pace of development around AI and tools coming at health systems and the potential means that our evaluation of them must happen much more rapidly than it used to. We
Mhm.
can't take 12 months to figure out if we like an algorithm. We have to take 2 months or whatever the case may be. Everything's got to be faster. So, how has that affected your work?
Yeah. Um, Primarily so beyond I know that we're talking about the simulation work, but I'll use this as an example of how I hope to scale within the simulation area. So the evaluation process, as you can imagine, is across the AI life cycle. Some of this has to do with testing our, like actually mathematically testing our AI solutions. So part of that is developing packages that we can run against the models themselves, leveraging things like we have Mayo has this houses index that is essentially a proxy for socioeconomic status.
Hmm.
And we found that specifically in one case that's published that I can speak of in asthma, a prediction of asthma exacerbation, the model performed less well in lower socioeconomic status. So you can imagine a pediatric patient within that fits within this low socioeconomic status category where we've seen low performance flagging. If the model says low likelihood of asthma exacerbation, if a clinician were relying entirely on the AI output, which we know may be possible in considering automation bias research that's upcoming, um, we would miss the opportunity for an intervention for a patient who
Hmm.
might already have potential care gaps just because this is flagging inappropriately, and this being due to missingness. And so we're looking at more automated processes to run these tests. The example that I just shared as well in terms of repeatable process. So we're starting to look at automation bias. And one of the simulation studies that we'll be running soon is based off of an award for AI enablement that my team um, secured knowing this potential tendency in health equity. So we're looking at building on top of our AI solutions a patient context reliability queue that we can not only surface, in a real clinical environment that allows a clinician to pause and think, is this might surface the evidence to say the model may be less performant, less reliable in this instance, consider other data, for example, and they can click on it and expose the AI output. Just like taking that concept and being able to apply it and replicate it, and then develop ways to observe that in a simulated environment is something that we want to be able to repeat. So this has implications both for testing, but also the post-deployment monitoring aspect of the work too. Um, Other examples, I think, in terms of kind of replicating or automating processes, we are building in, we've received funding now to build in ambient listening into the simulation center. So looking at the kind of upscaling capabilities for edge cases. In this
Hmm.
case, delirium is what we're looking at. But these types of capabilities will include, of course, video, um, ambient listening, but also sensing, um, eye tracking, things of the nature that would allow us to observe a patient or the environment within ambient sensing room, I think also could have implications for how we observe the clinician, as well as the workflow in general. And so part of my vision is to use the things that we would inherently use as metrics to test patients or humans, but apply them to the clinician AI interaction. And then from that, develop and flag automated processes, things like facial expression, for instance, um, and um, I guess I'm just trying to think of different. I guess I can't probably shouldn't name like specific companies that we are partnering with to do this at this point, but there are companies that have worked very hard to be able to flag aspects of human behavior. And I think that those automated processes can also be transferable to the way in which we observe the interactions within a simulated environment.
All right, very good. So, before I let you go, just we got a few more minutes here. Um, I would imagine there's some entities, some health systems that are doing the type of work that you're doing. I actually spoke to um, Dr. Susan Harkness Regley, who's a CHIO for Human Computer Interaction at the University of Pennsylvania Health System
Mm.
yesterday. So these are the first two interviews I've had like this, and I've had them back to back. So that tells you something about trends, right? So this is growing. This is, coming to the forefront. And I guess it's driven by AI. I mean, I think it's always been around, right? Human computer interaction, human factors been around for a long time, but it's coming sort of into my view now, probably because of AI.
Mhm.
Maybe it's more important than ever because of AI. It's more needed than ever. So we have this sort of growing area. There are going to be organizations that are doing it. There are going to be some that are going to start to do it.
Mhm.
So what would your advice be to organizations like yours, but who haven't quite moved as far along as you have, that want to sort of stand up this simulation, um, testing functionality? What advice could you give them if they want to get started?
Yeah. Um, I think to develop ways to efficiently start with the patient and then the clinical and operational problems, not with the model. Um, that I think that would save so much time and is the single most important thing to be thinking about. And the way in which to document that function. Um, I think that developing a strategy for shadowing the workflow. So, as I mentioned, we saw barriers in our evaluation that I think were the removal of which were catalyzed simply by having an implementation scientist do an appropriate or a thorough evaluation of this. Um, I also know that having attended for the first time the International Human Factors and Ergonomic Society conference, there are very well trained human factors engineers that are just starting to be engaged into AI evaluation. And it was striking to me the lack of exposure that they've had contrasted to the clear opportunity that they saw. And
Mm,
so even like something even like hiring a human factors engineer, implementation scientist, and there was a panel of leaders I recall from this conference, and they were all amazed that one hospital had a team of two human factors engineers. Um, I think like the awareness or understanding that area and appreciating the fact that there is an entire field already dedicated to this type of thinking that really just have to be plugged in. I think kind of creating exposure, creating, I guess, a pathway or pipeline or exposure to opening the doors for that knowledge to come into a hospital setting, I think would be really valuable.
yeah, it's just really interesting. What's new or what's the spot that sort of is really where it's all coming together. It's human factors meets AI meets clinical practice,
Yes,
right? I
exactly.
mean, that's really the spot where it's that Venn diagram thing. You got those three
Yeah.
circles, and you're right there in the middle. So good for you. That's that's a that's
I
a good
often find
spot to
myself
be in
there.
right now,
Yeah,
right? Right in the
yeah,
middle of that Venn diagram. And as you said, there's plenty of probably human factors engineers that have not that exposed to healthcare. I'm sorry, or to AI,
yes,
and let alone healthcare practice or clinical practice. So
yeah, yeah.
if you wind up sitting in the middle of that Venn diagram, you're probably going to have your pick of health systems around the country.
I think so. I think
Yeah,
especially if you keep interviewing people that are speaking on this topic and flagging this type of work,
yeah.
certainly.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm going to send Dr. Regley the link to this interview. I'm going to send you the link to her interview. So I have a feeling you guys could have quite a chat if you ever got together.
I think that's
Um,
fantastic. I've got
yeah.
a couple of colleagues also have been thinking about this problem for quite some time as well. I'd be happy to share their names with you.
Oh, great. It's just amazing to be at the absolute forefront. Let me ask you a final question. I'll let you go. Um, it's sort of not sci-fi, but your work could get a little sci-fi. What's the simulation of tomorrow look like? What can't we do yet in this world of simulation that we might be able to do in 2 years?
Well, 2 years might be ambitious, but that's how I roll. Um, there's been a lot of discussion about digital twin, and I
Right,
completely acknowledge that it's highly controversial. But I actually think that we could create digital twin environments for clinical settings that we could independently compute the potential interventions, even to the point of human behavior.
right,
Um, that would, I think, reduce the need, and this sounds odd because we're talking about human factors engineering, but reduce the need for humans to be present always, to do this testing. Like the humans, we are the bottleneck in this sense. And so the more data that we have to observe and learn about the interaction space, and again, like this automation bias, like what does this mean and how is it defined? How is it measured appropriately? Something as simple as this, I think, creating a simulated environment, a replication of it, understanding intervention, kind of the downstream impacts and data that this could surface. I think that that is the area that would be really interesting. I'm very open to any type of sci-fi, really, I think.
that's good stuff.
Yeah.
Good science fiction is brilliant. Bad science fiction is very sad and depressing. It's awful. The worst movies in the world are bad science fiction.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
But when you find a good one, that's gold.
Yeah.
Dr. Overgaard, this has been an absolute pleasure. I want to thank you so much for your time today, and
Thank
I
you.
hope we can catch up with you again down the road.
I would love it. Yes, in fact, I think a follow-up was a really good idea. Thank
All
you.
right. I'll definitely reach out again. So thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too, Anthony.